Rain marked the airfields of Britain as winter closed on 1940, and the workshops at Hatfield carried the smell of glue and seasoned timber. War orders demanded metal, armor, turrets, and guns. Yet on the benches lay thin veneers of birch and balsa, shaped into the form of an aircraft that seemed to contradict the logic of the time. Engineers spoke in low voices over drawings that proposed something lean, without defensive guns, depending on speed alone. The Air Ministry's paperwork had asked for something different, and memos reflected mistrust toward an unarmed bomber built largely of wood in an age of aluminium. The German advance across Europe and the pressure of the Blitz made doubts heavier, but the project continued. Geoffrey de Havilland walked between frames taking shape, hearing the same question repeated in careful tones. How could it survive against cannon fire, night fighters, and flak corridors? He answered with figures, not rhetoric, pointing to projected speeds that exceeded fighters and in frontline service. He refused to add turrets that would slow the airframe. Conversations in committee rooms echoed the frontline fear that crews without guns would feel exposed. One officer simply said, "They will be too fast to catch." Others resisted the idea with silence and turned pages to alternative designs. The push and pull of specification and innovation created delays measured in meetings rather than days. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe crews in dispersal areas spoke about the British penchant for improvisation. Reports mentioned an odd twin-engine machine of wood under development. The description invited jokes in mess rooms. Wood burned. Wood splintered. A pilot remarked that such a thing belonged in a furniture shop, not in combat. Confidence was still buoyed by recent triumphs and by the strength of the Jaguar. Yet radar screens and intelligence summaries inside Germany also recorded a growing resilience in British industry and a stubborn adaptation that refused to fit early wartime expectations. Bomber Command faced its own reckoning. Losses increased when heavily armed aircraft could neither escape fast fighters nor climb out of searchlights in time. Crews learned that weight meant drag, and drag meant being caught. Discussions among planners turned to alternative methods. Smaller crews, higher speeds, precision attacks instead of broad area raids. A machine that dispensed with heavy defensive armament could exploit these ideas if it worked in practice. The wooden aircraft at Hatfield became a focal point for these arguments without ever being named in the room. Files circulated under numbers, not headlines. The craftsmen who built it were not celebrated engineers in white coats but experienced carpenters, cabinet makers, and joiners redirected from peacetime trades. They understood wood as a material that could be strong when layered and curved, that resisted corrosion and saved strategic metals. They glued sections together under pressure and heat, creating a monocoque fuselage with smooth lines that needed no riveted panels. Each step in the process tested patience and precision. Doubt from outside did not disrupt the routine. Pieces joined, sanded, and sealed until the shape of the aircraft became undeniable. Flight testing brought the first answers. Engines spooled. Wheels left the runway, and the aircraft climbed cleanly. Figures recorded on clipboards 4-second looks. Speeds met and then surpassed expectations, turning skepticism into careful attention. Pilots returned from sorties aloft with remarks that were short but firm. "It goes!" The absence of gun turrets meant less drag, and the power of the twin Merlins turned that savings into speed and altitude. The A-frame strength surprised those who expected flex or weakness. The bonded would be behaving as a single shell. Throughout early reports, the tone remained cautious. Reliability needed proof over time. Armament in the nose and belly suggested roles beyond bombing alone: reconnaissance, pathfinding, interception. The aircraft refused to sit neatly inside existing categories. Staff officers redrafted tables of organization to accommodate something that could outrun escorts and also carry cameras or payloads over long distances. Each redefinition moved it closer to operational status. Pressure grew to make a decision before events forced one. The crews who first stood next to it saw no bravado. There was a sense of purpose shaped by the gravity of the war around them. Ground staff learned the particularity of wooden construction, how moisture had to be watched, how the skin required different care from metal aircraft. Pilots climbed into cockpits framed by laminated strength, glanced at minimal defensive equipment, and understood that survival lay in speed, altitude, and precise handling. Briefings emphasized routes, timing, and the necessity of avoiding prolonged engagements altogether. No romance, only the arithmetic of risk. News of its progress filtered through Luftwaffe intelligence channels, adding to the earlier jokes with a slight adjustment in tone. Reconnaissance photographs hinted at a sleek profile on British airfields. Reports from night fighter units began to mention fast intruders that appeared on radar for moments and then vanished. The word wooden remained in conversation, half mocking, but now carried an edge of curiosity. Intercept tactics depended on prediction. An aircraft that outran conventional climb rates unsettled that balance. In London, policy shifted under the weight of experience. The need for adaptable platforms became clear as theaters expanded and targets diversified. The wooden aircraft's versatility offered a solution to multiple operational gaps: fast, low-level strikes against precision targets, rapid photographic reconnaissance over defended areas, and night operations that avoided prolonged combat. Arguments that once blocked approval lost force in the face of measurable performance. The order books began to change. Factories expanded production under blackout conditions. Components moved by rail and lorry to assembly points in the countryside, away from the most heavily bombed cities. The use of wood allowed decentralized manufacture in small workshops, reducing vulnerability to concentrated attacks. Women and men trained quickly into new roles, working long hours to meet schedules shaped by the demands of the air war. Each completed fuselage marked the transition from concept to reality. The aircraft gained a name spoken with a mix of disbelief and respect. The de Havilland Mosquito entered squadron service not as an experiment, but as a working tool of war. Its crews learned to trust its acceleration, using throttle rather than turret to answer threats. The idea that would meant weakness began to erode among those who flew it. On the other side, Luftwaffe pilots still laugh in briefings when the wooden British machine was mentioned, confident that tactics and cannon would settle any question in the air. Operational plans formed quietly. Targets were selected for speed-based penetration rather than mass formation defense. Crews studied routes over sea and land, through weather systems and past known flak belts. The expectation was not to duel but to arrive, strike, and leave before. Interception lines closed. Radios carried few words. In and out became the unspoken method. The simplicity concealed complex coordination with navigation aids and emerging radar countermeasures. Engines warmed on dispersal, propellers drawing steady air across wooden wings that had already confounded predictions. The first major test under real fire waited ahead, beyond the coastline and into defended airspace where jokes about timber would meet the mathematics of speed and altitude. Crews closed canopies and checked instruments while ground staff stepped back. The aircraft rolled forward, carrying with it the weight of argument, doubt, and necessity, and the sky ahead promised the first answers in combat as wheels left the runway and Britain's wooden bomber headed east. Clouds stacked over the North Sea as the formation leveled. Throttles set for a pace that pressed steadily forward. Crews kept conversation to essentials. Timing mattered more than formation display. Each aircraft held its own line, trusting speed and height to carry them through the first interception belts before response systems fully aligned. The coastline came and went beneath them. Inland, warning networks began to react, telephones ringing in control rooms as plots crept across boards faster than expected. Controllers called fighter units to readiness with the confidence that twin-engine British aircraft could be run down once vectoring took hold. Luftwaffe pilots moved quickly to their machines, confidence still intact. The briefings had spoken about wooden construction with dismissive ease. Twin Merlins or not, weight and range meant vulnerability, and cannon had ended arguments before. Engines turned, wheels lifted, and interceptions began to form in climbing arcs designed to cut off intruders ahead of target areas. Yet the first encounters created unease. The British aircraft did not hold steady speeds typical of medium bombers. It surged ahead, holding altitude with surprising ease. Radio exchanges grew sharper as closing distances refused to contract in time. On the ground, flak crews adjusted sights and waited for the familiar pattern of bomber tracks. The pattern failed to appear. The intruders came lower than expected on some runs, higher on others, using speed to compress reaction time. Single targets rather than broad city areas drew attention. Strikes aimed at factories, power stations, and key nodes in transport systems. Explosions were followed almost instantly by receding engine notes that denied prolonged engagement. Reports arriving at sector headquarters used the same words again and again: very fast, twin-engined, minimal warning. Photographic reconnaissance missions revealed another facet. Cameras replaced bombs, and the aircraft crossed offended zones with the same indifference to interception. High-resolution images of coastal installations, U-boat pens, and industrial sites returned to Britain within hours, reshaping operational planning. Luftwaffe intelligence officers examined the prints and reached the same uncomfortable conclusion as their British counterparts had months earlier. Something did not match existing categories. A wooden aircraft should not be doing this. Within night skies, the effect deepened. Mosquitoes acting as pathfinders marked targets with accuracy that shifted bombing results. Night fighters sent to intercept heavies instead found themselves stalked by the fast intruder now adapted for air-to-air combat. Crews reported a brief blur crossing their path, then tracer from a British aircraft cutting in at angles once thought impossible for a so-called wooden machine. A German pilot who landed after such an encounter spoke quietly on the tarmac, "Too quick." The word spread faster than formal communiques. In British operations rooms, the effect of these missions accumulated. Loss rates for Mosquito units remained significantly lower than for heavier, slower types. This altered calculations at the highest level. Planners recognized that speed and precision could achieve strategic impact with fewer aircraft committed and fewer lives risked. The decision to expand production no longer stood on faith or argument. It rested on performance summaries and the changing patterns of enemy defense allocation. The aircraft that had once struggled for approval now compelled it. Luftwaffe Command responded with adjustments of its own. Higher performance interceptors were tasked to focus on the new threat. Tactics emphasized head-on approaches, steep dives, and coordinated radar control to counter fleeting targets. Crews were told that what did not make the aircraft invulnerable, that a well-placed burst would shatter bonded layers as surely as metal. The briefings tried to restore certainty. Yet in the air, reality intruded. By the time positioning was complete, the Mosquito was often gone, leaving only contrails softening into the upper sky or an engine note fading into distance. The laughter that had greeted early intelligence gave way to strained humor. In messes, pilots still used the word wooden, but now with a different weight, acknowledging a foe that contradicted assumptions written into pre-war doctrine. Aircraft designers received pressure to answer the challenge with faster night fighters and improved radar sets. Resources already stretched by the Eastern Front and Mediterranean campaigns now had to absorb another priority. A weapon that was supposed to be fragile had forced strategic reallocation. In Britain, crews returning from sorties spoke little about success in grand terms. They described fuel consumption, weather fronts, flak patterns, and radar interference. They noted that the A-frame held together under strains that would have worried earlier critics of wood. Maintenance teams inspected joints and skins and found the structure sound. This reliability under operational stress fostered trust, and trust translated into bolder mission profiles. Low-level attacks against Gestapo headquarters, prison raids intended to free resistance members, and strikes against precise industrial targets entered planning folders. The pressure on both sides intensified. Each success prompted a reply. Luftwaffe units learned to place fighters at likely exit routes, hoping to catch a Mosquito on the return leg when fuel loads and fatigue might slow responses. British crews adapted by varying heights, routes, and timing, confounding predictive models. This cat-and-mouse contest unfolded against the wider arc of the war, with cities under bombardment, front lines moving and governments measuring endurance in factories as much as in fields. Inside German command meetings, questions sharpened. How could an aircraft built largely from non-strategic materials undermine defensive systems designed for heavier enemies? Some suggested propaganda had overplayed the threat. Others pointed at damage reports that could not be ignored. There was no single decisive action to remove the Mosquito from the sky, only a recognition that it had altered expectations of what twin-engined aircraft could do. The word Holzflugzeug carried both scorn and reluctance now. Crews who once expected to meet lumbering bombers found themselves chasing a target they could barely bring into gun sights. Those few who achieved firing positions discovered that the wooden structure did not disintegrate at a touch. It absorbed punishment like any modern aircraft and escaped if engines remained alive. The myth of instant splintering vanished in the face of reality. Performance, not material, dictated outcomes. This realization spread quietly through squadrons, changing tone without formal admission of earlier underestimation. Back in British production halls, orders expanded further. Apprentices learned from carpenters whose hands had shaped furniture before the war. The continuity between peacetime craft and wartime necessity became clear in the curves of each new fuselage. Trains carried wooden shells under tarpaulins through darkened countryside, guided not by secrecy alone but by the speed with which they would soon travel unaided. Every finished A-frame represented a combination of resourcefulness and policy born from constraint. The narrative of the conflict shifted incrementally. Instead of mass alone determining power in the air, agility and adaptability began to dictate choice of tools. The Mosquito became central to this change. Its presence forced adversaries to accept that lightness combined with power could be more dangerous than armor and guns when used with discipline. Yet the contest was not over. Improved German fighters entered service with orders to prioritize the fast intruder. New radar systems promised better tracking. Pressure on Mosquito crews increased with each mission. Thunderstorms gathered over the next target region as briefings concluded for another deep strike. Crews studied the maps one more time, acknowledging the tightening net of enemy measures now directed at them. The earlier curiosity and skepticism had matured into respect on both sides, expressed not in speeches but in the precision with which each new operation was planned or opposed. Engines turned again. Ground chocks were pulled away, and the aircraft rolled forward toward a sky that had grown sharper with risk. The line between confidence and overreach narrowed as the next phase of the contest began, at the edge of cloud. The first wall of cloud closed around the formation as they climbed, instruments steady while lightning flickered somewhere beyond sight. The decision to press on had already been taken on the ground. Turning back would surrender initiative and invite interception in predictable lanes. Crews adjusted power settings, trusting the aircraft strength and the discipline of training. Ice formed and broke away along edges. Then the sky opened ahead. At that same moment, German controllers tightened their net. Improved radar arrays had begun to give earlier warning, and new fighter wings stood ready with aircraft designed to erase a Mosquito's margin of advantage. The first contact came without ceremony. German fighters gained altitude faster than in earlier months, guided with precision to converging points. A Mosquito crew heard only clipped warnings and pushed the throttles forward, altering course in increments. The enemy closed more than expected. For the first time, the British crews felt the limits of their speed-tested doctrine. The belief that nothing could catch them no longer held unchallenged. One pilot simply said, "They are coming up," and the arithmetic of risk changed at once. Within British command meetings, similar realizations gathered. Reports of narrow escapes and losses appeared alongside the familiar accounts of successful strikes. The Luftwaffe had altered tactics and equipment. Speed alone could not guarantee survival indefinitely. Engineers and A-crew debated responses. One camp insisted that the aircraft's concept remained sound if used with greater precision. Another pressed for incremental armament increases or armor plate. Geoffrey de Havilland and his team held to the original principle. More weight would erode the very quality that defined the Mosquito. The argument was not abstract. It reflected the lives of crews already committed. Across the front, German pilots now spoke of the Mosquito without laughter. A new fighter might reach it, but only if positioned perfectly. Fuel limits narrowed chase windows. When the British aircraft dived away at high speed or climbed into cloud, the pursuit often broke off. Yet the belief that it could be countered had returned, and with it renewed determination. Commanders considered the aircraft a priority target, ordering units to hold altitude reserves for surprise interceptions rather than exhausting themselves against heavier bomber streams. The turning point grew from these converging pressures. British planners initiated missions that relied not only on speed but on deception, split timing, and coordinated roles. Some Mosquitoes acted as decoys, drawing fighters away. Others struck secondary control centers, while main forces crossed gaps open in the defensive picture. This demanded exact discipline, and for the first time crews accepted that survival now depended on collective design as much as on individual aircraft performance. Brief exchanges during planning captured the shift. "We are not alone up there." The identity of the aircraft moved from solitary outrunner to central element in a broader operational method. A particular raid against a hardened facility brought the debate into focus. Intelligence indicated increased fighter cover and radar density. Canceling would concede momentum. Approving meant testing the Mosquito under the harshest conditions yet. Senior officers studied losses, production lines, and the aircraft's proven adaptability. The decision came with no flourish. The operation would proceed with route variation and minimal payload to maximize performance. It would either confirm the concept's resilience or expose its limits. The outbound flight met heavy weather and then clear air over the target region. German fighters were already climbing, controllers confident in their improved network. Flak burst marked predicted tracks. The Mosquitoes altered altitude in steps, refusing the pattern expected by gunners. One aircraft took damage along the wing edge yet held course, its bonded structure resisting the shock. Another dropped its markers and turned for home with fighters closing fast. Here the confrontation of ideas became tangible. Wood and speed against metal and doctrine, precision against interception. A German pilot finally achieved position off the tail of the Mosquito and fired. Pieces tore away, and the British aircraft shuddered but continued, engines still producing power. The pursuer pressing, surprised by the resilience he had doubted. Then the Mosquito dived at a rate that forced the German machine toward structural limits. The gap widened. Both crews returned with altered views. The German pilot reported that the wooden aircraft could not be dismissed. The British crew learned that outrunning was no longer effortless and now demanded judgment at every second. Back in Britain that night, engineers examined damaged A-frames. Splintered sections showed the nature of failure and survival in wood laminate. Repairs proved feasible and rapid compared to complex metal panel replacements. This practical advantage fed back into the strategic conversation. The Mosquito's material was not a weakness but a different path to strength, allowing quick restoration and sustained tempo of operations. In the face of higher enemy pressure, that tempo mattered. Production leaders and commanders reached a quiet consensus. The aircraft would not be weighed down by added guns and armor that contradicted its essence. Instead, crews would be trained further in energy management, formation spacing for mutual warning, and integration with supporting forces. Radar countermeasures advanced, extending the aircraft's margin without altering its core design. The choice was deliberate and irreversible. The war had forced it, and the Mosquito would remain what it was intended to be. Inside German headquarters, the same raid produced a different reckoning. Damage reports showed accurate hits despite increased defenses. Night fighter log recorded high-speed encounters ending with the British aircraft vanishing into cloud or darkness. Technical branches pressed for even faster interceptors and heavier armament. Resource shortages limited what could be delivered at speed. The wooden adversary had become a strategic irritant that tied up aircraft and crews urgently needed elsewhere. The confrontation of ideas settled not in slogans but in practice. One side doubled down on flexibility and speed, the other on interception density and technological escalation. The Mosquito now operated at the center of that contest. Crews sensed a change. A new respect from opponents translated into fiercer attempts to bring them down. Every mission carried the awareness that the aircraft's reputation had outpaced its immunity. Yet they also knew they flew a machine that embodied a clear decision made at the design table and reaffirmed in the air, movement over mass, initiative over reaction. Engines cooled after the raid while messages moved through command chains on both sides. Plans were amended, defenses shifted, new operations scheduled. No declaration marked the turning point, but its presence was unmistakable. The Mosquito was no longer an experiment defying expectation, nor merely a fast intruder embarrassing complacent defenses. It had become an essential instrument shaping the rhythm of the air war. Those who had laughed at would now adjusted every calculation around it. Dawn approached as crews prepared again, fatigue set aside by routine. The previous engagement had proven both vulnerability and strength. Each pilot and navigator understood that future missions would meet opponents equipped with hard-won experience. The margin of advantage had narrowed, but the choice had been made to keep faith with speed and precision rather than compromise into mediocrity. Chocks lifted. The aircraft moved toward the runway once more, carrying the weight of resolve that had formed in workshops, conference rooms, and open skies alike, as the next decision loomed ahead with no promise of ease. Engines took hold of the cold morning air and the line of aircraft lifted one by one, the runway falling away beneath them. The briefing map still lay open in memory, showing narrow corridors through layered defenses. Crews settled into the familiar pattern of measured speech and steady hands. There was no illusion of invulnerability now. The reputation of the Mosquito traveled before it, drawing dedicated interceptors and focused radar attention. The mission demanded a decision already taken. Proceed at the edge of risk to strike where conventional bombers could not survive. Climbing over broken cloud, the formation altered altitude to a level chosen not for comfort but for confusion of enemy tracking. German controllers noted the intrusions early. Plots moved faster than most previous raids, and instructions went out with urgency. New fighters with powerful engines stood tipped forward on dispersal strips, their crews already strapped in. Orders were clipped and direct. Priority target. Do not lose them. What had once been a source of humor was now a matter of professional pride and strategic necessity. The Mosquitoes crossed the coastline at speed. Flak positions reacted with practiced efficiency, but the aircraft refused to maintain straight, predictable courses. Each turn cost seconds in fuel but denied gunners their lead. The chosen target lay inland, hardened by concrete and surrounded by belts of defenses that assumed slow attackers. The approach route threaded valleys and industrial districts, where smoke and haze distorted range finding. The aircraft carried a load calculated precisely to preserve acceleration after release. Every kilogram had been argued over long before takeoff. German fighters arrived sooner than expected. The new interceptors closed quickly, and for the first time they did so with tactical confidence. They aimed not to sit on the tail but to cut across the projected path, forcing the Mosquitoes into maneuvers at bled speed. A British crew saw contrails ahead angling down, and exchanged only a single word between them. Now! The throttles went forward to their stops, and the aircraft answered with the full force of its engines. The wooden fuselage held firm under increasing strain. The target emerged through brief gaps in cloud. Timing left no space for reflection. Markers dropped, bombs followed with disciplined precision, and the aircraft pitched away immediately. Explosions reached defenses already switching attention to the outbound tracks. Sirens merged with engine noise. In the control rooms below, telephones rang with confirmation that the fast intruders had reached another supposedly secure site. The cost of underestimation had become structural. On the escape route, the pressure intensified. German fighters cut in from ahead and above, forcing split-second choices. One Mosquito took cannon hits through the tail. Control stiffened, but the pilot kept the aircraft level, trading altitude for speed in a long, shallow descent toward cloud. The bonded wooden structure absorbed shock that would have buckled thin aluminium skins in other designs. The navigator called headings with calm discipline, steering them toward a pre-brief gap in the defensive line. A pursuing German pilot pressed harder than doctrine advised, driven by the chance to end the myth. His fuel margin thinned as a British aircraft slipped into cloud, and did not reappear where expected. A second engagement brought the critical moment. Another Mosquito, carrying camera equipment rather than bombs, found itself bracketed by two fighters working in coordination. The crew faced the limit of the design. Speed as defense, with no turrets, no rear gunner to return fire. Evasion had to be pure geometry. The pilot rolled into a descending turn that strained both A-frame and body, and the aircraft held, the wooden shell transmitting force across its entire length. One of the German fighters overshot, unable to match the sustained turn without risking structural failure. The other broke off to avoid collision. The gap was small but real, and the Mosquito escaped into haze. Back in British airspace, returning crews reported fuel gauges near the line and engines hot with effort. Damage inspection teams moved quickly, examining torn skins and broken ribs. Repairs began almost immediately with tools more common to carpentry than heavy metal work. The speed of restoration confirmed another quiet advantage of the wooden design. Aircraft returned to service faster than enemy calculations assumed possible. Tempo became a weapon. While ground crews worked, senior officers reviewed the day's results. The raid had succeeded tactically, but the encounters with new fighters had shown a closing gap. The room carried the tension of a decision that could not be deferred. Should the Mosquito be altered to meet the rising threat with more armor and guns, or should its core philosophy be preserved despite high risk? The evidence lay on the tables. Low loss rates compared to heavier bombers, repeated penetration of strong defenses, strategic effects out of proportion to size. The conclusion emerged without rhetoric. The aircraft would remain fast and light. Training, planning, and electronic support would adapt around it. On the German side, the same events drove parallel choices. Reports from fighter wings confirmed that interceptions were increasing but decisive kills remained rare. Pilots spoke respectfully of an opponent that refused prolonged combat. Radar crews requested further upgrades, and production departments faced demands for yet more high-performance interceptors. Strain across the system deepened, resources stretching thinner across multiple fronts. The wooden aircraft had not just escaped. It had drawn scale strength away from other battles. Night fell, and with it came the phase of the air war in which the Mosquito had already reshaped expectations. Some aircraft now took off not to bomb but to hunt the hunters, intruding into German night fighter airfields and airspace. Engines idled on darkened runways as pilots waited for recall that came too late. A fast silhouette crossed the perimeter and was gone again, denying rest, disrupting rhythm. The wooden machine had moved from defense to initiative. A particular night's operation underscored the decision already taken in daylight. Mosquitoes flew ahead of heavy bombers, marking targets with precision that shifted entire raid outcomes. German night fighters, drawn toward the Pathfinders, found themselves chased instead by the same aircraft they meant to destroy. One radio call captured the reversal. "It is behind us." The sense of control that had underpinned earlier laughter at the wooden aircraft was now fully replaced by the awareness of being matched or outpaced. In British dispersal huts the next morning, fatigue marked faces but not uncertainty. Crews understood the balance they lived within: high speed as shield, discipline as survival. The aircraft design was no longer up for debate among those who flew it. They had seen its strength and damage, its acceleration under pressure, its ability to reach and leave targets that other bombers could not approach. They also knew the price of misjudgment had risen. There would be no illusion that would made them ghosts. Skill and decision alone carried them through. The wider war pressed in from every direction. Land campaigns shifted, Allied industry surged, and German resources contracted under blockade and bombardment. Within that larger movement, the contest between Interceptor and Mosquito continued as a sharp, focused duel. Each side refined methods daily. British planners integrated new radio countermeasures that confused tracking at key moments. German engineers chased incremental gains in speed and firepower. The sky became a field where doctrine met its consequences. One final mission in this sequence demanded everything the aircraft could offer. Whether marginal, defenses reinforced, and intelligence urgent. The order stood. Crews walked to their aircraft without ceremony, touching wooden skin that had traveled farther and faster than many had once believed possible. Engines started again in the darkness before dawn. The decision had already been made in earlier rooms and earlier flights. Keep faith with a concept that had changed the war's rhythm. The aircraft lifted into a sky that offered no assurances. Ahead lay radar nets primed for them, fighters tuned for interception, and gun batteries waiting for patterns that might not appear. In the cockpits, the calculations of fuel, distance, and energy began again, precise and unforgiving. Somewhere over occupied territory, the critical point would arrive where turning back and pressing forward carried equal risk. The Mosquito moved toward that line, its wooden frame carrying the accumulated weight of choices made by designers, commanders, and crews, as the war demanded yet another irreversible decision. The horizon thinned into gray as the aircraft crossed deeper inland, the first light flattening shadows below. Radio silence held except for essential calls. Fuel calculations narrowed with every course adjustment, and the crews felt the familiar tightening of margins that came with deep penetration missions. The target lay ahead, defended by overlapping belts of flak and fighters vectored by radar installations that had learned, through costly experience, to expect the Mosquito's speed. There would be no surprise in principle, only in execution. The first searchlights cut through the pale sky, sweeping for shapes that seldom stayed long enough to be held. Flak rose in ordered patterns, anticipating bomber paths that the Mosquitoes simply did not follow. The aircraft shifted height and heading again, deliberate and spare, conserving what would soon be needed for escape. Below, road networks carried military traffic toward fronts under pressure. Rail yards stood crowded despite early attacks. The rapid intruder had become part of the rhythm of war life on the ground, a threat known but rarely seen for more than moments. Fighter controllers issued new vectors. Improved aircraft now stood between the Mosquitoes and their return path. This was a critical point that planners had foreseen. Continue meant committing to a corridor that might close behind them. Turn back meant surrendering the precision strike that intelligence deemed essential. The decision came without words. Aircraft held course. The concept that had defined the Mosquito, speed, accuracy, minimal profile, required belief not stated but enacted in flight. The target appeared, a hardened installation central to communications and coordination across the region. Timing depended on a few seconds' alignment between crews who could not afford to cycle. One by one, aircraft made their runs. Bombs fell in measured sequence, not a carpet but a set of blows aimed at specific structures. Shock traveled through concrete and steel. Antennae bent and collapsed. Power flickered and failed. The sight that had helped guide interceptions fell silent at the moment of greatest need. German fighters arrived into sudden disarray. Radar handovers broke off mid-sentence, and visual search replaced coordinated interception. Engines roared across a sky where far silhouettes were already turning away. A few fighters managed contact. A brief engagement flared and ended as the Mosquitoes pushed their engines to limits set in test fields years before and proven many times since. Even so, the risk remained immediate. One aircraft lagged with an engine losing power, its wooden frame scorched by flak fragments. The crew exchanged no speeches. Checklists and headings filled the cockpit as they coaxed the aircraft toward cloud cover, keeping enough energy to deny the final closing burst. The outbound leg became a race bound by physics rather than hope. Fuel gauges edged downward. German pilots, frustrated by the collapse of guidance from their damaged control center, relied on instinct and chance sightings. A pair caught distant movement and gave chase, closing slowly. The Mosquito crew held straight for longer than doctrine advised, nursing the injured engine until it steadied. Then the aircraft eased into a shallow descent that converted height into speed. The gap widened. The pursuing pilots broke off, mindful of their own fuel reserves and the emptying horizon behind them. For those aircraft returning unscathed, the North Sea carried a different kind of weight. Silence settled into cockpits as tension leaked away by degrees. Landfall brought the routine of landing checks. Flaps, gear, the brief jolt of wheels meeting runway. Ground crews moved and as engines wound down, hands already finding the familiar lines of the wooden skin. Some aircraft showed damage patched by the mission itself, splintered leading edges, control surfaces pitted but intact. Others bore little mark at all, testimony not to lack of danger but to speed denying opportunity. Debriefing rooms filled with concise accounts. Times, headings, bursts of fire, radar interference, last sightings of the target complex through gaps in haze. No one marked the mission as heroic. The tone matched the aircraft, spare, exact, focused on results. Analysts compared these reports with intercepted communications. The struck installation had indeed gone offline at the moment of engagement, and confusion had rippled outward through the defensive network. The Mosquito had not only reached its target, it had changed the shape of the air battle that followed. In German headquarters, the consequences became clear with unwelcome speed. Fighter units reported missed interceptions, bombers slipping past while communications were rerouted. Commanders looked again at the assessment once made lightly, a wooden aircraft, interesting perhaps, but limited by its very construction. Now the same construction had delivered strength through lightness, resilience through design, and impact through the ability to appear and vanish before defenses stabilized. The laughter of earlier years had long since quieted. What remained was respect edged with frustration and the knowledge that no immediate solution was at hand. In Britain, the decision chain that had protected the Mosquito's core philosophy stood vindicated not by rhetoric but by outcomes. Production lines continued, woodworkers and engineers contributing in equal measure to a machine that had found its place in a modern industrial war. Young crews trained into a culture that asked for precision over display and discipline over bravado. They learned that survival came not from armor or numbers, but from timing, energy, and the relentless application of a simple idea pursued to its limit. The war moved toward its later stages, fronts collapsing and advancing in great sweeps. Within that vast movement, the Mosquito retained its role: pathfinder, intruder, reconnaissance platform, night fighter, and precision striker. It bridged gaps between categories because it had never been designed to fit a single one. Each mission reinforced a story told quietly across airfields on both sides. The aircraft once dismissed as wooden had outrun, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered repeated attempts to contain it, not by miracle but by design and the decisions that sustained that design under pressure. There was no final duel where everything was settled in a single encounter. Instead, the outcome emerged through accumulation. Factories hit, rail lines disrupted, headquarters silenced at crucial hours, night skies reshaped by an agile presence that denied certainty. Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the Mosquito as an adversary best met with anticipation rather than contempt. British crews spoke of it as a trusted tool that demanded alert minds and rewarded exact flying. The aircraft reputation became part of its effect, altering choices before engines ever started. When peace finally drew near, many of the figures who had argued over the aircraft's future recalled the turning points not as dramatic scenes, but as moments in rooms where charts and damage reports had spoken louder than opinion. The Mosquito's wooden frame stood as evidence that constraint had forced innovation, and that innovation, held firmly against pressure to compromise, had changed outcomes. A-frames returned to hangars, some scarred, some intact, all bearing the traces of missions where decisions had been made without certainty. Runways quietened. Workshops set down tools once used in furniture shops and concert halls before the war and now turned back toward civilian life. The aircraft itself did not ask for verdicts, but history offered one in practice. It had outrun and outgunned the assumptions set against it, and in doing so had altered how speed, material, and purpose were understood in war. Those who had once laughed at the wooden Mosquito had learned its lesson in the most direct way possible, through the limits it imposed on their plans and the results it delivered despite every effort to stop it. The legacy settled into a simple truth shared among those who had flown or faced it. Strength had not come from weight or spectacle, but from clarity of design and the resolve to hold to it under the most severe conditions. The Mosquito's path through the war traced a line from doubt to dominance, carried on wings built of wood and confidence tested in the harshest arena. Long after the engines fell silent, that line remained visible to anyone who studied how ideas become reality, how decisions taken in uncertainty shape events that follow, and how an aircraft once dismissed with laughter rewrote expectations by the way it moved through the sky.